It was when I was still in college, so it must have been 2 or 3 years ago. I had left the countryside to go to college outside the prefecture, and I got a call from my parents' house saying that my grandma had collapsed. She'd always looked after me, so I went back to my parents' house and went to the hospital right away. Fortunately, she wasn't seriously injured, but I took a week or so off from my part-time job and classes just in case. My brother was using my room at home and I was bored just lounging around in the living room, so I called my friends who were still in town. Everyone seemed busy, either working or going to college, but I managed to plan something with 3 of them the next day. The town where my parents' house is, or rather the prefecture itself, is really a rural area. So we went to an internet cafe about 30 minutes away to do some karaoke, go bowling, and play darts and shoot some pool. We talked about going out for drinks, but thinking that I'll be left with no cash if we did that, I declined. That being said, the only thing we could do was hang out at some family restaurant that offered refillable soft drinks and sit and talk for ages. On a Tuesday night, 2 days before I was to leave, I was hanging out at the usual restaurant with 2 of my 3 friends. I was complaining about how there was nothing to do in this town when Toru said, "Well, why don't we go to that place?" The place he was referring to was an abandoned hospital, an infamous place among our generation who grew up locally. There were rumors that equipment and scalpels were still left in the operating room, that there was a shriveled up corpse in the basement, that ghostly nurses appeared, and so on and so forth. The sorts of things that always plagues places like that. To be honest, I was scared of that place and didn't want to go, but both Toru and Akira seemed excited about it, so we contacted our 3rd friend, Koki, to join us. He said he would join us later and meet us there. The abandoned hospital closed down quite some time ago, and it's in an isolated area in the next village that has more rice paddies and farms than our hometown. It might have been built there because maybe land is cheaper in the countryside. The hospital had 3 floors and was probably quite impressive when it was first built. When we got there, Akira said that an acquaintance of his came to explore the hospital a while back, and he apparently went crazy after he flicked a cigarette onto the hospital grounds. Even though he lived in a different city, he kept saying he had to come back to this place over and over again. I barely replied, trying to act unbothered by this whole situation, but inside, I was honestly a bit pissed off he didn't mention this beforehand. The only thing we could see were some rice fields some distance away, peppered with streetlights that were too far and few in between to shed enough light to feel comfortable. The glass entrance to the hospital was securely locked with a chain and lock. It seemed like we weren't the only ones who came to explore this place. It was full of graffiti and most of the windows on the first floor were broken. I asked the guys whether we should wait for Koki. Akira said it shouldn't be a problem for us to go ahead since Koki would be able to see our car parked there and would know that we were already inside. Toru agreed and said, "Okay, I'll go first then. This window seems safe enough to get in from." We each had a cheap flashlight that we bought at a convenience store on the way over, and we climbed in after Toru. Thinking back now, I really wish I hadn't. The floor beneath my feet crackled when I hopped into the building from the window. There was broken glass everywhere. It sounded eerie in the silence and gave me instant chills. I seriously considered climbing right back out of there, but Toru and Akira wasted no time venturing further in, and since Akira had the car keys, I had no choice but to tag along. I trotted towards them to make sure I won't get left behind. You know the feeling you get when you're walking in the dark and you feel like something might come up from behind you? That's how I felt, and I hated being at the very back. The hairs on my back were standing and I was getting waves of electric pulses running up and down my body. I kept imagining a ghost that looked like Sadako from The Ring appearing from somewhere in the dark behind me and start chasing me. We got to the section of the hospital that looked like the reception area. Toru shone the light around and we could see the chairs still lined up on the floor and files and papers scattered around all over. They were all covered in dirt and dust. Behind the reception was, I guess, what you'd call the nurse's station. The windows were broken and the shelves had fallen over. It was quite A creepy atmosphere. Akira said happily.
Oh man, this is freaky. So where should we go next?
His voice echoed down the hallway.
Downstairs, of course. Let's go check out the dead bodies,
replied Toru. I had a really bad feeling and convinced them to go upstairs instead. I actually wanted to suggest that we leave the place altogether, but I didn't want them to think that I was scared. I realize now how stupid I was to worry about something like that. We peered into each room as we walked along the hallway and began climbing the stairs to the second floor. That's when I saw something strange. I was scared like hell and was still walking at the very back, so I kept turning around to make sure there was no one or nothing behind me. Anyway, at one point I thought I saw a pair of feet in the corner after we rounded the first set of stairs. The full view was obstructed because of the bend in the stairs, so all I could see were the feet. As soon as I saw them, I became glued to the floor and couldn't move. I could barely breathe properly. Toru noticed that I was frozen and called out to me, which jolted me out of this paralyzed state. I didn't tell them anything and convinced myself that I was seeing things because of how terrified I was, that I was winding myself up and my eyes were beginning to play tricks on me. The second and third floors were scary as hell, just like the ground floor, but nothing especially creepy happened. Some of the TVs left in the break room and smoking room were smashed, but that was about it. Akira laughed and commented that his acquaintance, the one who went crazy, was probably the one who broke all the TVs. When we returned to the first floor, Akira and Toru began heading down the stairs to the basement. It was the next obvious thing to do. But this time, I actually spoke up and told them that it wasn't a good idea to go down, and just as I had anticipated, they began making fun of me. It pissed me off, so yeah, once again, against my better judgment, I followed them down. The basement was extremely dark because there were no windows and therefore no moonlight. We shone our flashlight all around. Benches were still left out in the hallway. Bottles of disinfectant were hanging on the walls. There were wheelchairs here and there. Basically, everything was still left in there. But for some reason, it was awfully tidy and clean compared to the upper floors, and I felt like something was off. It was when Akira opened the door to the nearest room when Toru pointed the light down the hallway. He said,
Hey guys, check it out. Isn't that an operating room?
The light barely reached the OR, but we could see the light above the doorway, the ones that light up when the room is in use. We couldn't read what was written on it from where we were, but Toru excitedly began taking big strides towards it. Akira followed suit, and I began feeling sick from around this point. It felt like I had water trapped in my ears and began getting a congested feeling like when you're sick. I didn't want to be left alone in the dark basement, so I followed them while I felt like I was slowly drowning. I continued looking back behind me all the while. I heard Akira start laughing. Startled, I looked ahead and saw that Toru had tripped and fallen over, and Akira was laughing at him. He shone the light on Toru and told him to get up, but Toru was obviously in a lot of pain. His eyes were tightly shut, he gritted his teeth and clutched his shin as he moaned and groaned in pain. Akira immediately got back to his senses and asked if he was okay. Panic was slowly welling up in us, and Akira told me to shine my light on his legs so that he can check out the damage. Toru was in so much pain and didn't want to let go of his shin, but Akira forcefully yanked his hand away. We both yelled out in shock. Just thinking back on it makes me want to puke. The skin was completely split open, and I could see a sliver of white, which was probably his bone. And the blood. There was so much blood everywhere. Now, we were definitely panicking. Akira yelled out and asked how Toru fell and what had happened. I couldn't understand how he could have split his leg open as I used the flashlight to look around. The only thing I knew was that my initial gut instinct was correct. There was something going on in this abandoned hospital.
We need to get out of here,
I said. The two of us proceeded to pick Toru up from the ground. Akira draped his arm over his shoulder, and as I was making my way to his other side, I saw something that I will never forget. The flashlight that Toru had dropped when he fell was pointing towards the operating room. But the door that was initially closed had opened at some point, and something was peering out at us from inside. When you shine a light on someone's face in the dark, it makes their outline blurry and their eyes reflect the light. I don't know if you've ever seen that before, but it's freaky. Well, that's what I saw. I don't know if it was an actual person, but its face was close to that of one. Its body was round like that of an extremely obese individual. It was fleshy and saggy and was as tall as a normal person, but its width was incredibly wide. It swayed from side to side as it tried to come closer to us. That's all the detail I can remember about it. Akira screamed at the top of his lungs and began dragging Toru with him as he tried to run away. I probably screamed too, but I don't remember it. All I had in my head was to not drop the flashlight, so I gripped one in each hand, got under Toru's other shoulder, pinned his arm under mine, and we made our way back to the stairs as fast as we could. I couldn't hold the flashlight still, and the swaying light made it extremely difficult to see what was in front of us, which made things a million times scarier. We somehow managed to drag Toru and were getting closer to the stairs when I suddenly heard a rattling sound coming from behind us. The sound got louder and louder, and in my fear, I spun around and pointed the light at it. It was an empty wheelchair, and it was somehow moving on its own and speeding its way towards us. Because I had let go of Toru in my panicked state, the guys lost their balance. The wheelchair rammed directly into them with great force, and Toru toppled onto the floor. Akira had clearly lost his senses. He screamed and began running in the opposite direction at a tremendous speed. I called out his name when he ran past the stairs, but he continued screaming and ran deeper into the hospital in the opposite direction. I could hear his voice getting further away. I was crying and screaming at this point, and as I tried to pull Toru's arm to get him back up, I dropped both of my flashlights. When I turned my face down to pick them back up, I thought I was going to die. I could see its face clearly. It was a child's face. Just the face. If it indeed had a body attached, it would have been lying between my legs as the face was looking up at me from below. Sometimes an expressionless face could look angry. Well, this face was exactly that. The flashlight was on the floor right beside it, and it was lighting it up from the side. I couldn't help it. I ran away. I left Toru and Akira, and I ran like hell out of there. I don't think I would ever be able to apologize enough to them, but all I could do was save myself at that point. I genuinely thought I was going to get killed. I knew for a fact that I shouldn't miss the stairs, so in the pitch dark I ran with one hand along the wall. When I reached the stairs, I tripped and fell hard onto them, but my animal instincts kicked in and I galloped up the stairs on all fours. My eyes must have gotten used to the dark because when I got to the first floor, I could see my surroundings clearly in the moonlight. I ran to the entrance, but I couldn't open it because it was chained and padlocked. I didn't want to turn back around because I was terrified that I would see the child and the obese being behind me again. I kept rattling and kicking the door when I heard a loud thudding coming from up ahead. I didn't know what it was, but I continued to desperately open the door. And then a motorcycle appeared in front of me. It turned around and pointed its lights at me, and I finally stopped. It was so bright that I couldn't open my eyes. It was Koki. He had just arrived to meet up with us. At this point, I felt that I'd been saved. Koki turned off the lights on his motorcycle, put his helmet on the mirror, and looked at me with confusion. He walked over, and I couldn't hear him well because of the thick glass, but said something like,
"What are you doing?"
I shouted at him to get me out of there. Koki stood there for a couple of seconds, staring at me with an exasperated face. He began walking away, and I didn't want to get left behind, so I desperately ran parallel to him, and there, right at waist level, was a large section of broken glass. I didn't notice it earlier because of my petrified state of mind. Koki was saying it might be a bit too narrow and dangerous to use that opening, but I didn't give a damn. I squeezed my body into the tiny space and crawled out to safety. He was surprised to see me force myself out of that small hole. Once outside, I realized just how fast my heart was beating. I felt like it was going to shatter into pieces and I was having difficulty breathing. Koki asked me what was going on, but it took me a good 3 minutes until I could reply. The first thing I did was scream at him that we needed to get out of there. I wanted to tell him what happened, but I couldn't do it until I was far away from the hospital. This was starting to annoy him quite a bit. He asked me where Akira and Toru were, but seeing how desperate I was, he got onto his bike, told me to hop on, and we left the premises. While on the bike, I was still scared shitless and kept turning around to make sure nothing was following me. Koki yelled at me to stop because it was getting dangerous. He finally stopped his bike at a convenience store about 2 to 3 kilometers away from the hospital, and this time he was really pissed, saying,
What the hell is going on?
I did my best to explain what had happened, but at the time I was thinking about what I needed to do, about Akira and Toru, about the 2 things that I saw down in the basement, that I don't think I was making any sense at all. I remember saying something like,
We went down to the basement and Toru fell, and then something weird came out from the back and we tried to get Toru out of there, but Akira got rammed by a wheelchair that came out of nowhere from behind us and he panicked and ran off somewhere. And I was so freaked out, then I saw a kid's face by my feet and I left Toru behind.
Koki clearly couldn't understand and kept voicing his confusion, so I repeated myself 2 or 3 times, but I doubt I did any better on the 3rd time around. I was talking fast and probably wasn't enunciating my words properly either, so it must have been really frustrating for him. One thing he could definitely gauge was the fact that I was terrified, so he finally asked whether we were playing a prank on him, which I denied vehemently. I yelled that this was a really bad situation, and because I was making so much noise, the clerk from inside the store came out and asked if everything was okay. Even the people inside were staring at us. Not wanting to explain it all over again, I told the clerk it was nothing and turned him away. I tried to take my phone out of my pants, but my hands were so clammy I couldn't quite get it, and I was grunting and getting pissed off. Once I finally took it out, I called the police straight away, and as soon as Koki saw me doing this, his face finally turned from confusion and frustration to serious. They answered immediately. An old man's voice on the other end answered,
Hello, what is your emergency?
So I rambled on and said,
2 of my friends are in trouble at the abandoned hospital. Please come as fast as you can.
The man asked what the name of the hospital was, which I didn't know. I told him it was the abandoned hospital next to the mountain and rice fields. He proceeded to ask for the exact address. I snapped and told them I didn't have it and to just go to the abandoned hospital in town.
Right.
The man answered.
So what happened? An accident? A fight?
He honestly sounded uninterested and unmotivated. Absolutely zero sense of urgency. I yelled back and said my friends were injured and they needed to get there right this instant. Just then, I heard a loud static come over the line and I could hear the man saying,
Hello? Hello? Are you there?
I hung up once and tried to call back straight away, but for some reason my entire phone went dead. Thinking back on it now, I may have pressed the button for too long because my hands were shaking and turned my phone off by accident. I asked to borrow Koki's phone and snatched it from him before he could answer me. I dialed and hit call and the phone began to ring. At this time, the convenience store clerk came out again. This time, he visibly looked annoyed and asked us what was going on. I didn't give a damn about the scene I was causing at that time, but I must have been quite a nuisance to the others. I heard Koki began telling the clerk that he wasn't quite sure either, but that I'd gone to the abandoned hospital with our 2 other friends and something had happened. I walked away and focused on the call. This time, the emergency operator didn't pick up straight away and it continued to ring for quite some time. I finally heard a click, but no one said anything. I didn't have time to even consider the fact that that in itself was strange. I began talking and telling them again that I needed the police and the ambulance at the abandoned hospital. That's when I heard a sound coming from the other end. I couldn't tell what it was at first, but as the noise got louder, I realized it was a scream. A weird noise like a cross between a yelp and a scream escaped from my own mouth, and I threw the phone onto the ground. Koki wasn't happy as he ran to fetch his phone. He didn't get mad though. I was trembling and he probably saw how pale I was as I rubbed my ears and tugged at my hair as I tried to erase the agonizing scream that I'd just heard over the phone. I was sure of it. That scream was the scream that Akira had made when he ran off into the darkness of the hospital's basement. How could that have come through the phone when I dialed emergency services? Did I hear it in real time? If so, then what was happening to him right at this moment? My body ran out of battery. I fell to the ground where I was and I couldn't move. I stared off into space as my mind ran at 1,000,000 miles per hour, trying to make sense of everything. I glanced over at the store clerk looking at me in shock, but I barely registered what he was saying. He came closer and asked me,
"What's that?"
He let out a gasp as he informed me that I was bleeding from my arm. It was only then that I realized that I had cut my arm on a shard of glass when I had crawled out of the hospital. Koki apparently hadn't noticed it either. The clerk ran back into the convenience store and came out with his manager and an emergency kit. They sprayed disinfectant on my wound and lightly bandaged it, but the bandage wasn't long enough, so it quickly turned red. The manager went back and took a new box from the shelf to rebandage it. That whole time, I sat there completely out of it. Customers coming and going would occasionally glance my way as they walked past. Koki said I should probably go to the hospital to get looked at. That really scared me. Like a kid, I told them I was totally fine and that I didn't want to go to the hospital. I imagined being loaded into the ambulance and being taken to that abandoned hospital. I would have rather died than go back there. I don't know how long it took until I finally came back down to earth. I wanted to pay for the bandages and looked for my wallet, but it wasn't in any of my pockets. I must have dropped it somewhere inside the hospital. I watched Koki as he pulled out 2,000 yen from his wallet when his phone rang. He answered it. His eyebrows furrowed and he frowned. He looked at me and then back at the screen of his phone a couple of times before he said,
"Hello?"
The clerk took the money and came back out with the change a few moments later. Koki gave him a quick bow as he continued talking on the phone. The man asked me one more time if I was okay, to which I gave him a slight nod. My attention went to Koki as he continued talking to someone. He was starting to sound pretty annoyed and pissed. I heard him say,
"Yeah, at the convenience store." "Uh-huh, the one at the corner of that street. Yeah, he's here, but he's acting weird." "And what about you guys?" "What? You still there?"
When I heard him say that, I remember my stomach knotting up and I started trembling again. I can't describe the terrible feeling I got. Koki continued talking.
"No, he told me that you guys..." "What?" "Man, I knew it. You guys took it too far." "Uh-huh. Yeah, okay. Don't worry about it. Well, he's injured, so I think I'm going to take him to the hospital." "What? Of course there aren't. They don't even have running electricity there." "I told you enough is enough. It's over, so you need to stop right now." "I said quit it. You're starting to piss me off." "Hello? Hello?"
Koki was visibly angry as he hung up and sucked his teeth. He stuffed his phone back into his pocket as he glared at me.
"What the fuck, man?"
he said. I gave him a blank stare.
"That was Toru."
My blood ran cold. I could see his mouth moving as he spoke to me, but I don't remember what he said. Koki told me everything a few days later, but I apparently laid down on the ground and blacked out. The manager from the convenience store called an ambulance and I spent the night at a nearby hospital. When I woke up, it was around noon. I had an IV in my arm and my mum and grandmother were sitting on metal chairs next to me. The gash on my arm was pretty deep and I also had to get some stitches on the side of my face. I had also broken a toe, which I only realized when I tried to get up from the bed because it hurt. I got an x-ray and other tests done that afternoon, and that was it. I was told to stay in the hospital for another day, but I refused and almost went into a panic. That night, the police called me and asked me about Akira and Toru and what happened at the abandoned hospital. The next day, I went to the police station and was taken to an interrogation room where an old detective questioned me for hours. I only spoke the truth, how we got there and what happened inside, but of course he didn't believe me. In fact, I was told that I would be required to take a drug test and that depending on the outcome, my home could be searched. After going over the same line of questions for a while, I got tired of it and I finally asked a question of my own. Where were Akira and Toru? Toru was found by the police the day after Koki called them while I was hospitalized. They found him on the floor a bit past the stairs, dead. The initial cause of death was shock due to blood loss, but details won't be known until an autopsy is performed. As for Akira, they couldn't find him. He's officially listed as missing, but I think he's probably being treated as a suspect, like me, for killing Toru. It felt like the detective was trying to get me to confess to being an accomplice, that Akira was the one who actually killed Toru and I was hiding the truth from them. They will never get their answer because that isn't what happened. After this incident, the abandoned hospital has officially become off limits and is now under strict surveillance to avoid any more accidents or deaths. Akira's car that had been abandoned there was also searched by the police and his parents used the spare key to drive it back home. When the interrogation was over, Koki came to pick me up in his car. We went to the same family restaurant that the four of us had hung out together, and there he told me everything that happened after I blacked out. After he accompanied me to the hospital in the ambulance, on the same night, his older brother drove him back to the convenience store so he could fetch his bike. By the time he got back, the staff at the convenience store had finished their shifts, but he gave them a message to relay to the two clerks that were working there when everything went down. He then contemplated going to the abandoned hospital and decided to call Toru. When he took his phone out, there were 30 missed calls, and they were all from Toru. It was at this point that Koki felt that something was really off. It freaked him out, so he turned his phone off and went home instead. The next day, when he called Toru and Akira's house, he was told that neither of them had come home from the previous night, and so he called the police. He only told them the parts that were important by basically staying mute on the subject about the creepy stuff that happened in the basement, and the police finally went to check the abandoned hospital out. Because his story was so different to mine, it made them look even harder at me as a possible suspect for murdering Toru, but that's irrelevant at this point. Regarding that phone call Koki had with Toru just before I passed out, this is what he said.
When I first answered the phone at the convenience store, I thought something was weird. He kept asking about you and wouldn't shut up. He then told me that it was a prank that the three of you had planned and for me to bring you back to the hospital. But when I told him that you were injured and that you needed to go get looked at, he told me something strange. He said that there was a doctor there already. It obviously made me pause because that's impossible, and I told him to stop joking around. But he kept saying he wasn't lying and that he was in the midst of an operation as he spoke. I kept telling him to quit it, but the only thing he would say is, "It's true, there's a doctor here. He's here, he's here, he's here." That's when I got pissed off and yelled at him, and then he hung up on me.
I was honestly at a loss for words. And then Koki asked me to tell him just one more time about what happened that night. Now that it had been a few days and I was calm, I was able to explain everything properly, and the only response he gave was,
"Okay."
After that, I was called to the police station several more times. My parents advised me to submit a leave of absence form to my college and take the next month and a half until the end of the second semester off. The police have finally stopped questioning me, and I thankfully graduated from uni after repeating the first half of the year. I didn't want to go back to the countryside, so I just stayed in my apartment and found work in the city. It was the 4th or 5th time I went to the police. After repeating the same thing as usual with the detective, he mentioned the wound on Toru's shin. He knew I'd seen it when it happened, and he asked whether it looked more like a cut or a scratch. I told him I was really panicked and it was dark, so I wasn't sure, but that I did see something white.
I see,
The detective said and went silent for a few moments. He studied the documents in front of him again.
The wound on his leg was a strange wound indeed. We looked around the hallway, and no matter how Toru would have fallen, he wouldn't have sustained such an injury. There was just nothing there that could have caused such a gash. You really didn't see him when he fell over, correct? No, I didn't.
I replied. The detective gave a nod, and that line of questioning was over. When the interrogation ended and I went outside the room, and before the door had completely shut, I heard the detective muttering.
I doubt they would have bit him.
I really didn't want to think about it or remember it, but I brought up the image of Toru's leg. It's something I thought of only after hearing what the detective said about a bite, so it's most likely just my imagination. But maybe Toru was bitten by the kid I saw, the one that I saw right by my feet and was looking up at me. To this day, there are times when I can't sleep when my imagination runs wild. What if Akira or Toru called me on my phone one day? Hey guys, if you've made it this far, thank you so much for tuning in again. This single story was quite long, so I just made it into a single story episode. If you enjoyed it, there's another long single story video that I made, so feel free to check it out. I've put the link in the description box and at the end of the video. For those of you who like creepy stories from Japan and haven't subscribed, please consider doing so because that'll help me out a whole bunch. Cheers, and I'll see you again next time.